In this section, we're going to do some fun stuff. We're going to show you how to write a simple script which will help you regardless of the Unix, Linux system that you're operating on. Now, believe it or not, some of the simple commands that come with Linux, such as move, don't facilitate moving multiple files to new names. I'll show you what I mean. Let's open a shell. We'll go to temp2. We have a bunch of files here. We're going to make two files, one called test1 and test2. So let's touch test1, test2. Now, because you know about brace expansion, as discussed in earlier sections, we don't need to actually type the name out twice. Just do test, open brace, 1, 2, close brace, and we now have two new files. There they are, test1 and test2. They're empty, but that's besides the point. The files don't need to contain any data at all. They simply need to have a name and a reference and an inode pointer. They simply need to exist on the system. Now, you'd figure that with a system as advanced as Linux, that it should be quite easy to just simply pass in a command or pass in the proper arguments into the move command to be able to move test1 and test2 to new file names. Let's pretend that's what you had to do. That was the task at hand. Because oftentimes you have to do file operations, file I/O. You need to perhaps very quickly rename tens, if not hundreds, or even thousands of files very quickly, rename them, give them new names, and you may find difficulty doing so. You may end up going out and finding a script that helps you, but why when you can do it yourself and further your scripting capabilities? Now let's try to move test1 and test2 to new file names to see how it would work. Now you'd figure with brace expansion you could do something about it, so let's try it. Let's open brace and we'll put 1, 2, and then we'll try to move test1 and test2 over to two new file names. Let's call them LCBT as a prefix, LCBT test, and we'll open brace, we'll put 1, 2. According to the rules of brace expansion, this should work because the prefix is preserved while the suffix is changed, in this case 1, 2. Let's try it. As you can see, it fails. It says when moving multiple files, last argument must be a directory. If we ls letter LTR, you see that the files have not been touched. So brace expansion did nothing for us. How about attempting to move manually test1 and test2, two separate files, to two new names, such as LCBT test1, LCBT test2. This will also fail. If we LSLTR, it just doesn't work. So no matter how you do it, it just doesn't work. And this is a problem that has baffled many administrators, including myself, until we've come across scripts or have written scripts to simply loop through the files and make the changes for us. So let's write a script that'll help us to make these changes rather easily, and you can use these scripts on any other Unix Linux system that has a bash interpreter. We'll touch a new script, and we'll call this guy movemany.shell. And this is a useful script. And in typical fashion, we open it, we define the header. We have no choice, that's what we're supposed to do. Otherwise, when we go to run it, bash won't know what to do with it. It's good practice to put the author, and I always miss the quotes here, the date, and purpose in this case, used to move many files, or we should say to rename, but rename in the Linux Unix world is considered a rename. Excellent. So now how do we go about doing it? Well, the way bash provides, or the facility that bash provides to handle this troubling problem, although, or albeit small problem, it's still troubling, is via the for loop. We're going to run a for loop, and we're simply going to loop through the files that we're interested in. So essentially we're going to define an argument, a variable. This is why you need to pay attention earlier to the for loop section. We'll call that variable file. Now once again, there's nothing important about the name file. It isn't a reserved argument name. but it just simply makes sense. It's intuitive. So for file in, and this is where we use command substitution, we'll run the ls command and we'll give it the -A option because we don't want to see the implicit or the implied dot and double dot directories. And we can also specify a string. Globbing is certainly permitted. Globbing is when you use wildcards to essentially pluck out pattern matched file names and or directory names. So we'll ls big A or capital A, and we are interested in two files, test star. Both files are named or have prefixes labeled test. So we're going to say for file in LSA test star, that should return a list of two files. Now that we have the two files, we open the loop, we do, and then we do done. So somewhere in between do and done, we need to do our magic. And this is where we perform our magic. We can echo initially the file name before we go off moving anything, because moving can be destructive. So let's echo file, the current argument. So for each iteration, bash will echo the files that are found that match the pattern above. So for file in, whatever the output is from the LSA test star command. Now let's exit, and we'll run this particular file, movemany.shell. And there are two files in this directory, and there are other instances of test which come up. So what we'll do is we'll clean this up. We'll remove the test directory and the test directory with a space just to clean it up. So let's remove rf test, and that's the test directory with a space, and that's testing directory with a space, and we'll remove rf test. Now let's clear screen and rerun that command, and now we come back with two files. These files have are 0 bytes. We can lsa test star. You see how it comes out. If we add the L option, it shows it long. They're both 0-byte files. So at least our script is working. Let's show you that again. Our script lists the two files that we're interested in. So now we can actually run the move command against these files, because the for loop will present to the move command one file at a time, since it runs sequentially. Excellent. Let's modify our move many script. And what we'll do now is, instead of echoing it, we'll just comment out the echo line. We'll simply now type move file, and we'll specify a new file name. Now this file name can be anything. Let's call it, give it a new prefix, LCBT test. That'll do it. This could be a new prefix. And we could also, since this file is called test1, we can append a numerical value at the end of the file. That'll move it into the new file if we want, or anything else we have in mind. The files are called test1, test2, or we could simply rename it to the same name. So for example, we could go with move file to the same prefix. Let's say we wanted to just append an extension such as old. That'll do. So now the file name will be called test1.old. If we wanted a numeric, then we'd have to put a little more logic in, but that's not a big deal. So the files will now be moved. Let's show you that. We'll source it, and they've been moved. If we lsltr, you'll see the new files. Test2.old, test1.old. That's how you move multiple files within a Linux environment. You set up a for loop, loops through them, and then you can do what you need to. You can also use this for copying multiple files to new names as well. You simply set up a little script and you put the copy into it. Now let's further automate this script or make it a little cleaner. The pattern that we're globbing for can be variabilized. So we can variabilize this if we'd like, so that we can make use of it. And then we can define that variable up here as whatever we want it to be. That's something else to keep in mind. So that's how you move files. Let's just leave the test star in here. We just wanted to mention that you can actually put the pattern up top and then just put the variable here. But essentially you need to define a for loop and then move the file to some other name. It could be any name you want it to be, but if it's going to have a similar prefix, then you need to take that into consideration so that you don't run into duplicates or concurrency issues. Now let's go back to the shell. And if we try to run that command again, it'll fail. We get a 0, but the test1 and test2 no longer exist because the script actually ran. But in fact, what it did here was it renamed the two files because it matched the test pattern. So it renamed it, and if we did it again, it still matches. And it just keeps appending the .old. And let's look at it again, and it just keeps adding that extension. That's because we're globbing for the pattern test. And we can take a look at the script. This file could also be, or this script could also be named something else, some other generic name like copy move, because it could also perform a copy function based on the parameter that's passed in. Now also, since you know about positional parameters, you could make use of that here as well. So for example, you could have or make use of the positional parameter 1 as the pattern to glob for, and then this script becomes more portable. It becomes more useful. It's not as custom to test. And of course you should have some logic in here which checks for the presence of the positional parameter 1 because it is required. So if positional parameter 1 is not equal to 1, indicating that we need at least one parameter, then complain. Then we'll echo at least one positional parameter is required. And we'll exit. But remember what I told you before, if you source the script and it contains an exit, especially with an exit status, it will close the shell window. Let's just set a header here. We'll call it bad argument or insufficient argument. We'll give it a value of 165 because that's common. And then we'll exit with bad argument. So let's try that. If one positional parameter is not there or non-existent, then we don't allow the script to proceed so that the for loop doesn't fail. Now we want to actually change mod on move many so that at least the root user can execute it. And now we can run move many, and it should tell us at least one, as it has positional parameters required. Now we can give it a positional parameter, but we have to be careful of what we put because, for example, let's say we put 1. What does this mean? There is no such file or directory. Just examine the contents of move many. You'll see it's going to run an ls, and it's going to look for something 1. If there's nothing 1 there, then it won't work. Let's try it with test. And also there's nothing there because we're missing the asterisk in the definition. So for example, if we had test star, it says at least one positional parameter is required because the asterisk is picked up, although it is juxtaposed without spaces to test. So within the script, we could put, since we're moving many, you know that asterisk is typically required. Let's modify move many. We could put in the argument next to the positional argument 1 the asterisk so that it searches for the pattern plus does the globbing. Typically globbing is required when we're doing this, and it's moved it now without any complaints. And it's going to have an additional old extension because that's what we told it to move. We could set up the new name as also a separate positional parameter. That's another idea. So for example, right now this script isn't as portable because everything it does, or every file that it's able to move or rename, it simply calls it the same name plus an extension of old. We could totally variabilize or parameterize this entire section. We could leave the file name in and change the suffix to something totally different, like perhaps something that we specify, such as positional parameter 2. Now you begin to see more usages for positional parameters. But then, of course, in our logic up top, we should be checking for 2 positional parameters and having that here. Now, to make this much more portable, we should have another variable such as required req params for required parameters equals 2, and then make use of required parameter throughout the script. Now this is when you really become more portable. So if not equal to required param, something's wrong. And let's put that in here as well. Echo at least required param, rec param is required. So now we have two positional parameters. So we need to specify in the first slot the pattern to search for, and the second slot the new extension. Let's show you that. So we're going to run the move many script. It'll tell us that two positional parameters are required. If we put 1, and in this case test is available, it realizes that we haven't put. Now we need an extension. Let's call it new. Excellent. So now it's worked. And now we have our files. Excellent. Now the files preserved all of the other extensions because the other extensions are not the final extensions. Now they're called new. Let's show you that again. Let's manually move those files. We'll move test2.old over to test2. We'll begin with test2, and we'll move test1.old just to test1. So if we LSL letter, we have two files, and if we ran move many again, we need to give it two parameters. 1, the pattern to glob for, 2, the extension. Now, when we LSLTR, we have two files. The name, or the positional parameter 1, was the pattern that we globbed for, test, and positional parameter 2, new, is now the new suffix for these two files. So that's how you use positional parameters, and that's how you write a simple move many script to take care of moving multiple files for you. Of course, there's much more we could do in here. It depends on what you want to do, of course, but I've given you at least enough information so that you can move on and get more complex things done. And recall, as mentioned before, these scripts are certainly available on the CD to play with, and there are many more complex examples available online as well.